Harold Pollack, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm all right, Harold. Welcome to the Glenn Show. Harold, why don't you tell the audience out there who you are? Those who don't already know you, because you are a veteran of Blogging Heads.
I'm a veteran of Blogging Heads, although less than, I don't have my own show, which I'm envious of. I teach social service administration and public health at the University of Chicago.
Yes, you do. And I'm Glenn Loury of Brown University and of bloggingheads.tv. So, Harold, we're doing the Glenn Show today, and we have an agenda. What are we talking about?
Well, we've got a couple things on our plates. We've got how one balances the role of being an academic with being sort of politically active. We've got how to think about angry populism and some of the comments made about Mitt Romney's experience at Bain. We've got, is Dan Savage wrong to be so mean to the critics of gay marriage? And we've got why health reform is such an important and worthy thing that I think needs to be really defended. And that's my list.
Okay, that sounds like a good list. Let's go. Why is health reform such an important thing and needs to be defended? And why is it, I wonder, that more people on the left and even why the president himself are not more vigorous in advancing the achievement of the Affordable Care and Patient Protection Act for the great event that you say that it was? Why is that?
Well, I think that there are several aspects of health reform that are really quite important. And, there's a reason why for 70 years people tried to get this thing passed and couldn't, and that and felt it was a big deal when it was passed 2 years ago. First of all, we've established the principle that every American needs to have access to affordable health insurance, and that insurance actually has to work if you get sick. And that's an expansion of social provision in America that's really quite important. And I understand why people who are focused on global warming or who are focused on various financial reform issues might say, hey, I'm disappointed that we couldn't get certain legislative achievements done during the Obama first term. But from my point of view, as someone who went around the country talking to a lot of people with health problems who were medically bankrupt or people who need essential substance abuse treatment services that they couldn't afford, I look at what's happened and I say, hey, President Obama really delivered something, and Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid and many others actually delivered on a historic accomplishment that got 30 million people access to health coverage, and that's already changed a lot of people's lives. So I'll give you one example. There's about 2.5 million young adults aged 19 to 25 who are now insured because they can go on their parents' health plans. This includes Senator Scott Brown's children who are taking advantage of this provision, which is not without irony for those who follow such things. So one is we've covered a lot of these people. But what's interesting is that some of these people are people with really serious health conditions who otherwise would really have a hard time getting their needs met. So if you go to a pediatric oncology unit, you'll discover there are people who get chemotherapies, who have pediatric leukemia or whatever they have, and then they reach age 18, and then the question comes up, okay, what's going to happen to those people? And the answer is right now, at least until age 25, which will get them over to the full implementation of health reform, which happens a couple of years from now, they can stay on their parents' insurance. And this is actually really important for a group of human beings that really need help. Another issue that comes up a lot, so I do a lot of substance abuse research. And if you take some guy who's bumming quarters on 57th Street in Chicago who's got a drug or alcohol problem. So, he's not a mom, he's not a vet, he doesn't qualify for any of the standard disability programs, but he's got a serious drug addiction problem. You say, how do we pay for the services that he needs? And up to before the passage of health reform, the answer was, well, There's this patchwork of programs, none of which work very well, which would pay for that. And under health reform, that guy is covered because he's poor. One of the key provisions in the Affordable Care Act says that if your income is below essentially 138% of the federal poverty line, you're eligible for Medicaid. And the federal government, by the way, pays for the lion's share of what that would cost. So that's hugely important. So there's a bunch of provisions like that. I'm getting into the weeds here a little bit, but those are really important.
Well, no, just let me ask you a couple of questions about it then. Why not let people stay on their parents' health insurance until they're 35? Would that be better than letting them stay until they're 26?
Wait, did you say 85?
No, I said 35.
Oh, 35. Well,
35.
I think that it is a valuable way of acknowledging that the trajectory to economic security in young adulthood takes a lot of people a longer time, and this is I think that you need to have a compromise position on this because we have to take into account how employer-based health plans are going to work and be sustainable. But allowing these young adults who are starting out, taking lots of different jobs in their early 20s, maybe they're in school, maybe they're working at Starbucks or wherever they're working, allowing them to go through that phase while they can stay on their parents' health insurance is a realistic way that we can sort of understand what life looks like for millions of Americans. And by the way, what's interesting about provisions like this... I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm trying to push back here a little bit by saying these things that you are putting forward as unalloyed goods come with a price and with an opportunity cost. And I'm not exactly sure why it's a social or collective responsibility to, configure the insurance regime in such a way that decisions about household independence and autonomy in life can be delayed into the late 20s or to the 30s. I see why people who get the benefit of having that option would want to have the benefit. But you talk about this as though this were some kind of, you say, an expansion of social commitment, enrichment of the safety net. Not your words, but that's what I took from it. And I'm just wondering why, if this is so good, why not more of it? I mean, there obviously have to be costs that are reckoned in the calculation here. And anyway, so.
Well, I think, first of all, the cost. I think by allowing people the possibility of, by having a program that draws in a large number of young adults and creates a sustainable risk pool, the costs are quite manageable for this. I think one of the issues that I'm concerned about is there's a subgroup of 19 to 25-year-olds who really would have a hard time getting insurance because they have some sort of issue. Maybe they have diabetes, maybe they have autism, maybe they have whatever they have. And this is a way that we can pull those people in, or maybe they're low income at that point in their lives. And this is a way that we can create a really financially quite reasonable way of covering those people. And I think that if in the abstract, a lot of Americans would say, well, why do we need this kind of expansion of public regulation and entitlement? But when you actually put that to people, you discover that lots of people say this is actually pretty reasonable and affordable, and I'm going to take advantage of it. And it doesn't upset me to realize that my own monthly health premium as a University of Chicago employee has slightly increased because my peer down the hall has their son on this thing. So we have. I don't think it's worth spending a huge amount of time in our conversation on, but I think it's just there are lots of particular provisions in health reform that, as they get enacted, are popular and solve concrete problems for people. And as we're sort of waiting to see if the Supreme Court sabotages the whole thing, but this is
sabotages. I thought they were going to be interpreting the Constitution, Harold.
Well, I would say that a
to the extent that
I would
this-
say that a 5-4 decision by Republican-appointed judges to overturn decades of post-New Deal jurisprudence on economic policy would be an ironically sort of breathtaking act of judicial activism. That
and I would say that that's one reading of what
Yes.
such a hypothetical I say what you just said is one reading of what such a hypothetical ruling by the court might mean. Another one would read the opinion quite differently, wouldn't it? I mean, it would be not overturned. Anyway, I don't want to parse the issue because I think I probably agree with you about the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act. Well,
I think, by the way, it relates to other
You
things
really
we want to
think
talk
that
about
this-
today, too. Because I have some pretty strong commitments and values claims that,
Can we finish this one first?
Okay.
I want to ask you, you really think that this is a done deal? Because the last time I checked, the law wasn't all that popular, or it was at least a plurality of people who were clamoring for it to be repealed. So the idea that an accomplishment has been made in terms of a shifting of social attitude remains to be seen.
Well, I think politically it's not
a
a.
specter of courts.
I would say politically it's not a done deal, and I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is some of the most important provisions were backloaded in a way that you pass a bill in 2010, and the really heavy lifting doesn't happen until 2014, and therefore that gives political opponents 2 election cycles to try to defeat it. In fact, 3 election cycles for some things, the provisions that are actually on the ground and working are
Well,
actually
if those
done
things had
deal.
not been backloaded, the legislation wouldn't have been enacted in the first place.
I think that's quite. I think that some of that reflected strategic errors by the people pushing the bills. Some of that reflected what needed to be done to get 60 votes in the United States Senate, and sort of the tenure, the need to produce certain budget numbers in the 10-year budget horizon. I think that was. I was very disappointed that it was so backloaded, and I think there's
an
a
election
political error.
coming.
Mm-hmm.
There's an election coming, and the opposition candidate and opposition party are unreserved in their contempt for the law and publicly committed to repealing it. So it would seem to me that the accomplishment that you're calling attention to hasn't actually occurred yet. And
Well, it
won't
certainly has
occur
not
unless
accomplished. It has
until-
not.
It won't occur, unless and until the election of 2012 ratifies the decision that the Congress and the President made in 2010.
Well, I am quite concerned
sorry.
about that. I agree. It has
Go on.
not been politically. It has not been politically ratified yet, and I think that an Obama reelection is really important. And I think resolving the legal uncertainties is important. And by the way, I think there are going to be many glitches along the way, given the complexity of what's being done. I'm not sanguine about health reform, but let me just say that I think there's another
The
issue.
political campaign. No, before you move on, I just want to try to parse this political thing. The president is not putting health care reform forward as a centerpiece of his reelection campaign. Did I miss something? This enormous accomplishment that you're calling attention to, which needs to be ratified in an election that will happen in 6 months, is not being cited as a mainstay of the campaign, even though the campaign is largely the venue where this accomplishment, in quotes, will or will not be ratified. So I'm still befuddled about that.
Well, I think there's a couple of things going on. I agree that there's a wariness among Democrats to embrace this, and I think many of us expected it to be more popular after it was passed than it's turned out to be. And I think Republicans have been effective in being able to frame things, in part because I think Democrats have been a little bit less out front than we need to be in just explaining this thing and defending it and being proud of it. I think for a variety of reasons, the American public was exhausted by the process of what was required to pass the thing. In fact, one of the things that I really
Or
worried...
disgusted by it.
Well, I think
disgusted by it.
they may have been disgusted by it, but I think if they were wrong to be. I think they're right to be disgusted by the fact that our institutions work so poorly, and there are so many obstacles to passing legislation that force you to do a lot of bargaining, and bargaining that was always done in private and is now done in public. That people hate the process of legislation, and we have a system where it's so much easier to play defense than it is to play offense, that you can just drag your feet and wait for the public to become disillusioned by it. I'm worried, by the way, that a future president would look at President Obama's experience and imagine some really big issue like global warming, and they're saying, we really should. Someone's elected and says, I really want to focus on this huge problem, and it requires complex legislative solution, and his Rahm Emanuel equivalent will sit down with him and say, look, this is what it's going to be. Our opponents are going to drag this thing out as long as they can. The public that is expecting more dramatic change than our political system can really deliver, and by the time we're done, this thing is not going to be a political win, and it's going to stop us from achieving some other important things we want to do. And there'll be a kind of legislative Vietnam syndrome setting in, where Democrats and Republicans both will shy away from solving really huge problems because our legislative structures are so cumbersome. I agree with you that people were disgusted, but I also think there's another aspect of this, which is that many of the beneficiaries of health reform are disorganized, low-income people who are just not at the center of political power in the United States. And one of the really concrete manifestations of inequality is that we have, 1/6 of the population is uninsured, and a much higher percentage of working-age adults, and their voices are just way less important in the political process than many other people's. And, the amount of people who are really upset that President Obama has potentially been unfair to Bain Capital is maybe 1/1000th of the number of people who are upset because they have a cousin who can't get medical care. And yet it's so much easier to get opinion elites to be outraged by the oversimplification of an economic populist message that offends the economic elite than it is to get people in the sustained way to be really offended at the lack of help being provided to tens of millions of our fellow citizens. So I think that that's also in the mix as well.
I see. So why don't we move on to another topic, the related topic that you've mentioned about precisely this issue of people's outraged feelings on one or another morally relevant political question being, expressed through populist, caricature and so on, demagoguery and so on.
So it seems to me I watched with interest your conversation with John McWhorter, in which you discussed what we owe people who are having trouble as human beings kind of staying apace with the really rapid rate of cultural change around issues like gay marriage. And it seems to me that you argued that we have to have a greater sympathy and respect for the humanity of our relatives and friends who are a little bit behind on this issue and who have very strong personal and religious commitments that they're wrestling with in dealing with an issue like gay marriage. Have I accurately described?
Yeah, I just want to add, what I was saying was that when you have change in social attitudes around a question like gay marriage, some people are going to change more quickly than other people away from what had been the traditional view on the question. And those progressives who are going to be out front will have a temptation to look back on those who have yet to evolve to the point of the newly arrived at position. They'll look on them with disdain or with scorn. They'll call them bigots or whatever. And I thought that was a kind of superficial morality of in a situation of relativity where the values were in flux and the society was arriving at a new equilibrium. The sort of presumption of those who were out front to show contempt for what had gone before. And I also said, and I'll just finish, that these institutions that they're disparaging, particularly the religious traditions and practices, could be resources for a kind of tolerant and humane management of the inescapable problem that society's views about sensitive matters will evolve. So to throw away religion because some religious traditions have not yet embraced gay marriage is to make a superficial moral judgment and probably also to make a practical mistake. So
Well, I mean,
that's my position.
I think there's a lot, by the way, to that position, and I don't completely dismiss it. And in fact, if you look at the way that I try to talk about issues like this, I certainly try to be mindful of what you were mentioning. There's certain issues where we see that religious institutions are such pillars of humanity that we need to embrace. I mean, for example, the immigration issue is one where religious institutions are often expressing some values that no one else is expressing. You know, there are undocumented immigrants in our country who are good people, who are picking our fruit and shingling our roofs, and yet we don't want them to use the emergency rooms in our hospitals or send their kids to our schools. And the Catholic Church has been an eloquent voice for the humanity of in many cases, their own parishioners. And my own, my in-laws were people who were socially conservative folks who I admired in many ways and who I disagreed with. And I think you always have to separate what your respect for people with your disagreement with their, with a particular view that they might hold. It's astonishing how quickly American society has moved on an issue like gay marriage, and I think we should be embracing of people who are a little bit behind in that. But I think what your argument was missing was, I think, in a way, you're not really understanding the humanity of someone like Dan Savage and why he's so mad about it. If you are a gay person or a lesbian person, every Sunday in America, in tens of thousands of church pulpits, people are standing up and are denigrating your humanity and are supporting a policy agenda which is deeply harmful and disrespectful. And one of the ways that people respond to that, partly as an expression of their own identity and humanity, is to get mad and to say, what? There's
hold on a minute, please.
Okay.
I don't accept the characterization. So I'm in this church that I do attend from time to time. It's an African Methodist Episcopal church, and it's relatively conservative theologically. Okay, so they don't think abortion is right. They think it's wrong. Now, some think it should be legal. Some don't think it should be legal. But they all think that it's morally wrong, or almost all of them think that it's morally wrong. They are not assaulting women's health in thinking so, even though laws could be passed which would have the consequence of impairing a woman's health to the extent that the laws embodied some of the views of anti-abortion sentiment characteristic of this church. Likewise, they don't think that same-sex unions are blessed by God. Okay? They think that it's unnatural and contrary to God's word. That's what they think. And thinking that, they could indeed lead to laws being passed which would not recognize gay marriage or whatever, and that could be harmful to people. But their view, their judgments, their reflection of the moral traditions that they're embedded in are not assaults on people's humanity, I would say. And oughtn't so to be characterized. So I just wanted to say that. I don't know if where do I go wrong here? I don't see anybody assaulting me. If I say, I don't think God bless same-sex unions, I believe that it's contrary to nature, how is it that is an assault? I mean, that's a statement of a person's conception of how the world is ordered. I want to be clear. It's not my personal view. I've said it here on Blogging Heads before. That's not my view. But this language, Ted Kennedy said when Robert Bork was nominated to be a Supreme Court justice back in the 1980s, and Ted Kennedy stood up on the floor of the Senate and gave a speech. And in that speech, he said Bork wanted to slam the courthouse doors on the fingers of the poor, and he wanted to drive women to having back alley abortions. Okay, the Catholic Church, in its opposition to abortion, wants to drive women into back alleys. That's the kind of rhetoric, that's the kind of savage-like rhetoric, and the pun is intended, that I'm objecting to.
Well, let me make a couple of comments.
I said my piece. Thank you.
No, you've made some good points. By the way, I think the Catholic Church is interesting because I actually think it's a very mixed bag historically, and I really admire Vatican II because, in a sense, what Vatican II was, it was a real act of contrition, an incomplete act of contrition, but a real act of contrition by a church that had actually, in a general way and also in very specific ways, had done some really tremendous harms. And religious traditions include wonderful elements, and they include very toxic elements, and it is, in changing the liturgy, that relates to, the Easter sermon and so on. They've made some very concrete changes and acknowledged some of their historic wrongs in a way that I think is actually tremendously admirable. I think the abortion issue is actually quite different from either contraception or gay rights, because I actually think that as a liberal pro-choice person, I think that we have to respect that people have very strong reasons to believe that abortion is both morally wrong and an appropriate object for public policy. And I think we have to appreciate that there are reasons for deep disagreement there that cannot be argued away. And I actually think that I have, the people within the developmental disability world, there's a variety of perspectives about the abortion question among people that have made important contributions to a humane society. And I think we have to be respectful talking across that divide. And even though I'm unapologetically pro-choice, I think that it is wrong and superficial to talk about abortion as if we were talking about these other issues. I think the thing about abortion is that there's a variety of moral and political arguments that you don't have to be religious to believe that make you say there's problematic aspects of abortion. I think that's much less true when we talk about, for example, the Catholic teachings on contraception. They are really rather baffling to those of us who are not Catholic. I mean, if you actually sit down and try to understand, what are the moral arguments here against the use of artificial contraception or against in vitro fertilization, they are literally incomprehensible. And so when the Church tries to bring those in...
Have you read, let me just ask you, John Paul II's book, Crossing the Threshold of Hope?
I have not, but I've read some of the documents from the 1960s that laid out these original arguments. And tell me about John Paul's book.
Well, what he does, I'm not going to be able to recount his position. I don't recall exactly how the argument goes in this book, which I read 20 years ago or whatever it was. But what he does is he poses this problem of what the Church would have to say about human sexuality in all of its various aspects, in reproduction, homosexuality, adultery, abortion, and all this. And then he tries to defend. The Church's evolving doctrines, which are rather conservative even after Vatican II. He tries to defend them from a kind of humanistic point of view. I mean, from a kind of, from the spiritual posture that we human beings, although we are embedded in a material flux, are being creatures of God, standing somehow above it, while we have the yearnings and temptations of the flesh. We have also a spiritual aspect of our being, and that we express our humanity in the extent to which we're not slaves to the material and fleshly and worldly, but the extent to which we can transcend them, and that the church's doctrine is an effort to institutionalize and embody that aspiration.
Let me stop you right there. Let me stop you right there. I think that the
Well,
moral vision that's being promoted there, there's a lot to admire in that, and certainly, I think that the moral virtues that are alluded to there are important ones, and I think that where the church is fundamentally illiberal is in its failure to recognize that in order, when they try to influence public policy, that there has to be a public basis of justification which goes beyond Catholic theology and that's compelling to a range of people in our society who have no particular reason to share that theology. And I think on the issue of abortion, they can make a case that actually that has a much broader argument there that has to be respected. I think that on the issues of contraception and gay rights, that they really don't, and that what we're arguing about, it's not just whether no one's saying that the Catholic Church should be forced to to have gay marriages in their churches, but they're out there in the public sphere lobbying for policies that affect the ability of gay couples to get access to public resources, to get the legal resources of marriage, to have their health insurance and hospital visitation and all these other issues treated in a way that treats them the same as other Americans. And when you oppose that, you really can't be that surprised that somebody like Dan Savage is going to come after you because you are really taking an agenda that comes from your own religious tradition and imposing it on other people, and also imposing policies that in 2012 America are unacceptably illiberal. We just, and I think that's important.
What I'd say, Harold, is that I don't know any law that doesn't involve the imposition. So, yeah, I get that. And I grant you, and I think it's a useful observation, that these issues differ. That is, abortion is different from contraception, is different from gay marriage, in the extent to which, a kind of overlapping consensus, I think that's what the philosopher John Rawls called it, can be established. We don't affirm the same, detailed moral visions of the universe, but we are here in a public, environment where we have to live together within a society, and when we argue with each other in public, we have to argue in a way that at least it's possible to persuade people who don't share your core beliefs to arrive at some kind of consensus that can cover all of us. Mm-hmm. So I agree with all that, but I'm still objecting to Dan Savage, and you say he's adversely affected by the fact that people's religious views might end up having public expression. Well, when the country goes to war, we're adversely affected by the fact that some people's views might end up. But I presumably ought to be bound by some rules of civility when I engage in debate with my fellow countrymen about war and peace. When the country sets its tax policy, it's affecting many people and affecting them, some of them adversely. We have different views about it. Nevertheless, I should be bound by norms of civility in the discourse. I don't understand why the fact that you're gay and somebody wants to pass a law or fail to pass a law that would adversely affect you or that would benefit you were it to be passed, that authorizes you then to engage them savagely purely because of the fact that you're personally affected.
I think I agree with you that norms of civility should be respected. And by the way, I think that, as a public health person, I would like to see us engage the Catholic Church. To give a specific example, Pope Benedict noted that there's certain contexts in which the use of condoms by sex workers might be a lesser evil than unprotected sex for people in that situation. And I think I would love to have conversations with the Church to try to build some sort of a positive relationship about what is the Church's view about that, and can we, because on HIV prevention there's been this incredible wall between the Church and those of us in the public health community, and it's been very harmful. And I think there's room there for greater civility and negotiation. And if we just lampoon the church all the time, we're not going to be able to achieve that. I think I try to write in a way that honors the norms of civility. I don't write like Dan Savage does. But I think that one of the reasons why he does what he does is I do think that people who are gay who are exposed to very, very powerful and sustained criticisms of them at a very basic level, that one of the responses that people have to that is invective, is ridicule, is all of the weapons of persuasion and self-assertion that people can come up with. There's young gay teens who are subjected to bullying and to mistreatment, who need someone out there who's sort of out and proud and who's saying, you know what, these people are saying all sorts of things about you, and I'm going to respond to that. And I think that every minority that faces that kind of ridicule itself in the public square, that they're very often part of the process of healing from that and responding to that is to have figures like Dan Savage who respond aggressively. If we didn't go through the HIV crisis, if we didn't have people from Ronald Reagan to Jerry Falwell who responded so cruelly and ineffectually to the death of eventually hundreds of thousands of gay people, then I would say, someone like Dan Savage that's really unacceptable. But we have a history there where actual living adult people have experienced this, and so I think that you have to give him a little bit of slack because of that. It's not like me talking about tax policy. It's him talking about the way that he has been treated and described in the public square by very powerful people in our collective life for decades.
Okay, so from that I'm going to take that you're a fan of Jeremiah Wright, that the comparable acts of aggressive pushback, of denouncing of injustice, of the expression of fury in the face of a history of mistreatment, that manifested themselves in the person of Jeremiah Wright and his various sermons and so forth. You could understand that in the same light, I would have to ask.
Well, I listen to it differently. I will say that I listen to Jeremiah Wright differently than I would listen to some others because of that history. And I think that, he said a lot of different things. And I think, by the way, I think there's many... Yeah. If you look at what Jeremiah Wright said and didn't say, there's actually some important distinctions. Somebody who, in the world of community-based public health, the kinds of things that Jeremiah Wright were saying, we've all heard that sort of stuff for decades. And a lot of the people that I've worked with over the years hold opinions that are not super different from Jeremiah Wright. And some of the opinions they hold, I should tell you that I deeply disagree with a lot of the things that he said. If somebody's running around saying the CIA caused AIDS in Africa in 1965, or some of the particular things that he was at least sort of intrigued by, now that's wrong, and people shouldn't be saying that. That's actually a totally different thing, though, from somebody saying Jewish doctors are spreading AIDS in 2012. And I can actually work with the guy who has a conspiracy theory about the CIA in 1965. I can't work with the guy who's saying the second stuff. And, I think that, I certainly think that African-American firebrands speaking on the street corner, that they are expressing something very deep within the African-American community that I don't have to agree with. I don't have to, pretend that I agree with it, or that I should rebut the crazy stuff that people say. But I also have to listen to this and say, this isn't coming out of nowhere, and I have to, and the best way, by the way, very often to rebut that stuff is not to directly say this is really stupid nonsense, but to actually show concrete. Okay, go ahead.
No, we need to move on because time is limited, but and I want to talk a little bit about Bain Capital because let's take Dan Savage as emblematic of a certain kind of angry critique of conventional views about homosexuality, and your defense of that as a guy who's fighting for his people, quote unquote, and for his own life in a way, and who's outraged at some of the injustices. Now, I see that as being completely different than a cynical, hypocritical, calculated, demagogic campaign of trying to discredit a political opponent with, lie, innuendo, distortion.
Is that actually, by the way, do we know that people are actually lying about Bain, or do we think that they're presenting an oversimplified... It seems to me that the critique
it's the latter. It's the latter. I can't point to lie. I mean, there may be some false statements in that, but I'm not able to say what they are. But I do feel that the activity of private equity is not only legitimate, but an essential aspect of the functioning of a modern economy. I do feel that a businessman or woman who undertakes their activities in order to make profits for their investors is doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. I do feel that such a person is not disqualified from being president of the United States, or not as qualified to be president of the United States in virtue of the fact that they were concerned about making profits rather than about expanding employment, and I find that whole line of argument to be demagogic in the extreme. I do think that running a business successfully prior to running for president is probably a vastly superior training ground for developing skills to be an executive at that level than are the activities that our current president undertook before he went into politics. So I see the attack on Bain Capital and on Mitt Romney to be what I think it is, which is perhaps politically effective. We will see certainly cynical, since you're hypocritical, prepared to take money from the very people that you're attacking, not the kind of politics. Cory Booker and I agree about this, the mayor of Newark, New Jersey. We agree about this, not the kind of politics. I mean, I can't vote for Mitt Romney, okay? I can't vote for Mitt Romney. I'm going to vote against Mitt Romney. But President Obama is making me hard to feel good about voting for him to the extent that he conducts a campaign in this way. Okay, so.
But either way, it's such an interesting... It's such an interesting thing for a couple of reasons. And I wish I knew more about how, I think that the world of private equity, it's an unsentimental world. I wish I actually knew more about just what Romney actually did and how, how this company actually behaved when they took over a company in problematic circumstances, when there were implicit contracts with workers and communities, et cetera. Just what did they actually do? And I haven't seen, I personally haven't seen a sort of fair accounting of that has the kind of specificity that you would need to understand what to actually think of Bain Capital. And, if you discover...
Well, let me just mention...
I agree with you that private equity... I'm sorry, go ahead.
Harold, let me get this on the record. Ross Levine, the economist, and I have a blogging head from January on precisely this subject. He's an expert, and he goes in that hour-long discussion into detail about the nature of private equity, as well as calling attention to some findings in the academic research literature on the employment effects of the reorganizations that private equity firms undertake. And on the whole, the judgment is that, there are some job losses in some parts of the firms that are reorganized, and there are also some job gains in others, and the net effect is pretty much a wash. And besides, jobs is not the main thing that's going on. Reorganizing assets in a way that allows them to go forward productively is the main thing that's going on, and that private equity does pretty well. But in any case, I just want to get that on the record.
I mean, I agree. There's a stupid. There's an element of stupidity in the discussion of these matters. I certainly would grant that, and I think exemplified by that when people went after Romney when he said corporations are people too, and everyone who knows about economic policy knew exactly what he was talking about. And there was just nothing.
That infuriated me, Harold. I just have to say that infuriated me. All he meant was corporations are merely legal fictions, and that behind them are the people who own shares, the people who are the customers, the people who are the suppliers, and the people who are the employees, and they're all people. And if you do something to those legal fictions, you will affect people. That's all he meant.
But let me get to
cheap political rhetoric. You know, I mean, it's still going on MSNBC and everywhere you look. He said corporations are people too, which is it's a kind of demagoguery and a kind of ad hominem.
Well, let me.
He's so out of touch. He and his rich buddy.
Well, he is out of touch.
He doesn't even know
the thing is he is out of touch because someone who has. Well, let me give you some concrete examples. I mean, if he didn't present himself like the upper class twit of the year, these attacks would be much less effective. I mean, let me give you a couple examples. So there was this question of I think if for those who are Monty Python fans, they know what I'm talking about. So there was this question of Anne Romney. You know, she was criticized in a clumsy way, and as she pointed out, this was sort of a birthday. So you know, she's a person. So she struggled with cancer and multiple sclerosis, and I obviously wish her the very best on that. But you know. There's a reason why the National Multiple Sclerosis Society and the American Cancer Society's advocacy, they are big supporters of the health reform bill that her husband is trying to repeal. And, you know, she has been through this incredible challenge. Her husband's been through this challenge. And the lack of empathy that they project towards people who often face the same challenges but who have 0.01% of the resources to deal with them, it is objectionable. And I think that there are is perfectly. I think the anger that people feel towards inequality and the excessive influence of the affluent in our society at many levels, people are right to be angry about that. And I think that it's not that Bain Capital was doing something wrong, but okay, you were the guy who was the top of Bain Capital, and you were participating in the valuable, creative, destructive process that we need to go through to reallocate assets in our economy. So you saw in a very immediate way the human impact of what has to be done to repair unsuccessful businesses, and so on. So tell me, what is it about your perspective and about the policies that you advocate that are really going to help the people in the bottom half of our income distribution who are really suffering right now and who are being treated as factors of production in an economy that doesn't seem to value them very highly? And I think that it is striking to me that policy elites, political elites in both the Democratic and the Republican parties are very, very leery of economic populism and have not found a way to talk in an honest, intellectually credible way that speaks to the real anger that people have, because the people realize that economically and politically, I mean, why is it that people like Cory Booker came out about the Bain ad? You know, there's 50 million ways that campaign rhetoric by Democrats, by Republicans, is oversimplified, is using symbolic language that's a little bit not quite right to make a broader point. And why is it that Bain Capital, all of a sudden people are saying, wait a minute, that's not kosher? And I think it's because social networks of political donors, of the friends of ours that we went to school with, and so we know these people. We think they're smart. We think they're important to us. They're our donors and so on.
I don't think that's all of it. No, I think that's part of it, but I don't think that's the largest part of it. First of all, let me agree with you about the fact that we have not found an effective way to channel people's disgust and anger and outrage at inequity and inequality and disproportionate influence of the wealthy into our politics in a healthy way. We have not found that, and I point to the Tea Party as exhibit number one. That is, it exists only because we haven't found an effective way to channel that kind of energy into the politics constructively. So I agree with that. But what I want to say about those like donors on Wall Street whose money to the Democrats is drying up, according to a recent report in the New York Times, because they're concerned about the president's populist rhetoric, president and the vice president's populist rhetoric, I think it's not just about networks. Those are people like me. I know rich people and I like them, and you can't talk about my friend Mitt Romney like that. It's also that people, I think, correctly perceive that if you let that one loose, if you let that kind of sentiment loose, that kind of, for want of a better term, class warfare sentiment loose, that kind of rampant popular, that kind of Huey Long fury, that kind of anti-establishmentarianism, if you let it loose, you'll reap the whirlwind. It'll destroy the foundation of your own prosperity. It's going to lead you down a very bad path. And they don't want to go down that path. Sure, there's self-preservation in it. I'm rich, you're attacking the rich. Don't attack people like me. But there may also be a correct historical perception that this kind of politics of envy and this kind of politics of resentment of the rich and this kind of anti-business sensibility and this millionaires and billionaires rhetoric is really, in the long run, very bad for the society and leads to very bad public policy.
I must say, I think we are so. When I look at when I look at what's happened, I mean, we have just gone through 15 years of slashing the progressivity of the tax code. We've just had a massive bailout of the financial sector. We are. Okay. I mean, there's 4 empty houses on my street that are, that solid working class people lived in, and that there has not been. If we were living in a world of populism that allowed us to run roughshod over contracts with banks and had a Huey Long style element in our politics, these people would be living in their homes right now. We are so far. And if you look at what Mitt Romney's political agenda is, it is shifting dramatically resources up the economic scale. We are so far from. I think actually, if we keep moving in the direction that the that the Tea Party, for example, wants to push us in, I think there really may be a more populist movement. I mean, yes,
of mostly working class and middle class people.
I mean, what we've had instead, by the way, at the Tea Party is a populist movement of older white people who are. I mean, one of the things, by the way, I admire about Theda Skocpol and Vanessa Williamson's book about the Tea Party is the way they're very respectful to the people in the Tea Party, but they're also emphatically and properly appalled by the actual policy agenda that the Tea Party populism projects, which we're cutting Pell Grants, cutting benefits for younger people, supporting programs in an extreme way for the
my only point, excuse me.
Okay.
Excuse me for interrupting.
Go ahead.
We're pretty much out of time here. My only point was to say. You just observed correctly, and I stand corrected, that the vector in American politics in the last 15 or 20 years has been very friendly to the rich, and so a little bit of populist demagoguery coming out in the 2012 election oughtn't to cause all these people on Wall Street to go reaching for their pistols, since they're winning already. They're not losing, they're winning.
Yeah.
And I take that point. But I just then wanted to go on and underscore the fact that populist anger has manifested itself institutionally in American politics in its most prominent form in the Tea Party. And those are not rich people on Wall Street, as you note. And I think that leaves a question it should leave a question in the minds of observers like you and me about how is it that if there is legitimate anger against the people who are running the economy and so forth, when it comes to getting reflected in actual political activity and institution building, it's coming from the right and not from the left, and it tends to reinforce at least some of the policies that you would have thought such people would be objecting to. I think that requires to be explained.
I think if you actually look at who the Tea Party are, by the way, I think the Tea Party people, they tend to be older, fairly affluent conservative Republicans, and they're supporting an agenda that is beneficial to older, mostly white affluent Republicans. So they're not exactly the. I think we can really romanticize what's actually going on there in any number of ways. And I think the issue with Bain Capital is not so much that the truth is getting its hair mussed about the details of Bain Capital, but that there's a real need for Democrats to present a credible agenda that really addresses the everyday suffering of people in a real way. And to say, we're happy that Bain Capital is out there doing that, but if they're going to be doing that, there's going to be a reshuffling of assets, and there's going to be a bunch of 58-year-old workers who are going to lose their jobs sometimes, and we have to make sure that we have a safety net for those people, and we have to have a functioning financial system, but sometimes that financial system produces some really negative consequences, and we have to have a plan for that. And I think one of the problems that we've had is that I think people are disgusted because the political system does not respond to the needs of ordinary people as much as it should, and so and I think that there's a market for a kind of populist outrage, and the irony is if it's projected against Bain, it's going to end up being it may help President Obama right now, but it doesn't lead to, it's not programmatically very fruitful. In the same way that saying, if you focus on the fact that Mitt Romney paid 14% taxes, that to me is quite outrageous. And that's what, and I'm sure, by the way, that what will happen is that when we actually get a look at his tax returns over a longer period of time, nobody will be talking about Bain anymore. They'll be talking about whatever tax avoidance vehicles he's been using to shelter himself from paying.
Yeah, let me just observe that the main provision that allows these guys to get such low effective tax rates on their earnings is one that the Democratic senators from New York, Chuck Schumer and Gillibrand, are very much in favor of. I mean, I just want to observe that it's not Mitt Romney or the Republicans alone who are standing in the way of revising the tax code so that it would be more fair.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. I would say, by the way, the irony that very rich people live in blue states. Okay, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I'm going to be late for an appointment if I don't terminate our conversation now.
Okay.
And I apologize for abruptly ending, and there are topics that we didn't get to. But you have the last word. Go ahead and have it.
Well, thank you for having me, and I totally agree with you that the irony of the very wealthy living in blue states and having very strong connections to socially liberal but economically often moderate or conservative senators and congressmen it's one of the most frustrating aspects of our political life for those of us who are more progressive, and we haven't found a way to really effectively deal with this problem.
Harold, the next time we talk, we ought to talk about how academics can and could or should and shouldn't be explicitly and overtly partisan political actors, because I thought that was a very interesting topic and we didn't get to it this time.
I'm sorry we didn't, but it's a pleasure talking to you, and I'll be less verbose next time so we can get to our full agenda.
I'll see to that, Harold. I'll see to
that. Okay. I may hold you to that too, though.
All right. Take care of yourself. We'll talk later.
Bye-bye.